Welcome to tonight's program, Writing in Impossible Times, Thinking with and Beyond the First Book, a conversation between Ken Wissoker and Macarena Gómez-Barris. My name is Stephanie Guyett. I'm a PhD student in comparative literature at the Graduate Center at CUNY and a fellow who works on the Intellectual Publics program with Ken Wissoker. Intellectual Publics brings together an audience that includes faculty and students within CUNY and beyond, as well as artists, writers, and scholars from outside the academy. This year, the program has presented a number of fantastic talks with thinkers from many disciplines, including Jennifer Nash, Susan Stryker, Aisha Baliso de Jesus, Monica Miller, and Brian Masumi. All of these are available to watch on our YouTube page. We're excited to end the academic year with tonight's conversation, which is geared to those who are working on dissertations or book manuscripts and are wondering how their methods and ideas may work in a larger discourse. As Ken posted a few days ago on social media, the current economic climate for academic presses is quite precarious, and this too will be addressed. There will be time at the end for questions, so please feel free to enter yours at any time in the Q&A function. Now for the speaker introductions. Ken Wissoker is Senior Executive Editor at Duke University Press, acquiring books across the humanities, social sciences, and the arts. In addition to his duties at the press, he serves as Director of Intellectual Publics at the CUNY Graduate Center. He has published more than 1,400 books, which have won over 180 prizes. Among the authors whose books he has published are Stuart Hall, Donna Haraway, Eve Kosofsky-Sedgwick, Achille Mbembe, Lauren Berlant, Jack Halberstam, Sarah Ahmed, Christina Sharp, Fred Moten, and Lisa Lowe. He has also worked with artists and writers including Lorraine O'Grady, Greg Tate, Randy Weston, Fred Wesley, Cherry Moraga, and Alexis Pauline Guntz. Macarena Gómez-Barris is an interdisciplinary scholar, speaker, and author of 4 books and dozens of essays and interviews on environmental media, decolonial theory and praxis, creative and embodied research methods, and what she calls, quote, antidotes to the colonial Anthropocene, unquote. Her work addresses artful living and survivance in spaces of social and ecological suffering and include the books The Extractive Zone, Social Ecologies and Decolonial Perspectives from Duke in 2017, Beyond the Pink Tide, Art and Political Undercurrents in the Americas from UC Press in 2018, where art and lost my footing, where memory dwells, culture and state violence in Chile from UC Press as well, 2009, and the volume Toward a Sociology of a Trace, co-edited with Herman Gray and published by the University of Minnesota Press in 2010. She is working on 2 in-progress books. Maybe she'll talk about those tonight, maybe not. Macarena is Timothy C. Forbes and Anne S. Harrison University Professor at Brown, where she is the chair of the Department of Modern Culture and Media, the founder of the Elemental Media Lab, and the inaugural director of the Center for Environmental Humanities. So very busy. Welcome to you both.
Thanks so much, Stephanie. It's been really wonderful working on intellectual publics with you. This is the last of the year, and welcome, Maka, and thanks so much for joining for this conversation. And the time is even more impossible than when we first planned to conversation. So I'm really glad that you're here.
Thank you for having me, Ken. It's an honor to be here with you, and congratulations on such an illustrious career of publishing and such important work, such important volumes, such urgent work. and always leading the way in terms of academic publishing. So just to honor you first for all the work that you've done for the field.
Well, I could go on at great length about your inventiveness of creating new spaces and fields for thinking as well. And really, I know you were involved in a big collaboration on race and global environments between Duke and Brown this past weekend. So I really appreciate you coming for the conversation today and talking about publishing. So.
It's great. I mean, I think to get us started, one of the things I've been thinking a lot about, and I know you have been thinking a lot about, and that wonderful but serious and poignant Facebook post and Blue Sky post that you made about the kind of way in which publishing, I would call it maybe a weather vane for other kinds of intellectual cultural work in this arena that we work in, right? Where we're in a transitional moment in many ways. And I think from my vantage point as a university professor, as someone who's worked with you on a series, and just mentoring and thinking with young people and graduate students as they face these kind of very uncertain futures. I mean, I wondered if we could open with the topic of maybe how you see the changes in publishing now. And maybe before I hand it right back to you, I'll say something about, we're focused here tonight, and thank you all for coming and joining us. And we look forward to an enlivened conversation with you. But the focus is around the first book, thinking about the first book in impossible times. And one of the things that strikes me, and I'm curious to hear your reaction to this, is that certainly when I was in the midst of writing the first book, there was a lot of pressure, a lot of pressure to produce that first book for the tenure file, to, you get the job and then it's about keeping the job. And the first book was always a marker of that, publishing it in a good university press. But that book was part of a portfolio and seen as if you were on your way to your second book, where maybe you could do the real project, the project that would make the big contribution. So I could say a lot more about this, but to make it short, I'm wondering if you've seen a change in terms of what the first book is supposed to do in terms of making a contribution, innovation, etc., versus maybe 10 to 15 to 20 years ago.
Well, I definitely feel like there's more push and more desire to be creative right away. That partly because a lot of the kind of forms that were the inherited forms of what does a sociology monograph look like? What does an anthropology monograph look like? What does a literary criticism book look like? As those have kind of happily opened up stylistically, and people admire more creative writers like Saidiya Hartman or Christina Sharp or whoever, there's more desire to get to that sooner, and perhaps more writerly practice hoping to get to that earlier. Uh, and so I find myself really encouraging people to go with it if they have the skills, the desire to work on it. At the same time, I try and remind people it's genuinely hard, that if you look at like either Saidiya's 3 books or Christina Sharp's 3 books, you can see how much work they did on the writing to get from one to the next. But a lot of this for me is also about audience and what does it mean to have a book that people might want to read rather than the older form of, oh, there's going to be enough academy, that there'll be enough libraries, that'll just be your contribution to the field, which was conceived in some progressive way as ongoing. And I think the kind of uncertainty now means more reason to try and say, well, what are you trying to say and to whom earlier on?
That makes a lot of sense. I mean, I do think that there's a desire to quote unquote cross over, to maybe find one's voice earlier. But I also want to say from my perspective that, I mean, those are really, really important impetuses, and I think that you put it in such a positive valence. And I guess I want to just put a little pressure on that for us, thinking with you together, and maybe you don't understand it this way or see it this way, which is fine. But I think from where I sit, just kind of seeing the pressure that's coming in on these, you know, um, the kinds of jobs, as we know, the changing university. I won't call it the neoliberal university because I've been questioning what that means of late and trying to pin down the kind of transitional political economic moment we're in. But it's certainly one of, it's pressurized. It's very highly pressurized. And it's one in which the first book is not just about keeping your job, maybe, but also about really, it seems to me, making a big contribution, you know? And I could name all kinds of people, but I feel as if I name this group of stellar people, then people will feel like they have to compare, you know, and that's never good. So it's not about necessarily, you know, kind of reaching that, I don't know, just that larger contribution space. But I do think there's a way in which the first book, I felt like I could explore more. I could explore the literature. I could feel my way through making the transition from the dissertation to the first book. And now it feels like you have to enter the field, right? And kind of make the splash. So I'm just curious from your perspective if you feel that. I certainly, when I'm looking at hiring pools, when I'm looking at candidates, when they come for jobs, that's certainly part of what I see people kind of thinking about. So.
Well, one interesting thing would be how much the dissertation itself has changed. So that things that would have been perfectly okay dissertations in any given field in the late 1900s, now if somebody came in with that as a proposal, you'd be like, really? That's all you want to do here? So I think people might be starting in a more ambitious or more creative place, or thinking more of it less as like a set of exam questions. Can you read these 5 novels? Can you say something about this group of 3 writers or 3 painters? That the kind of what I will sometimes describe as the kind of positivist version of the dissertation, where the proposal is based on a gap perceived in literature, like, oh, we've never had an ethnography of this city or this area, or um, there's never been a monograph about this artist. So you're kind of filling in as if it were like a Wikipedia article that didn't exist yet. That form of dissertation, I think that's still a piece of it. But I also see, and I've been up and met your brilliant students, that people are doing like much wider and more creative things from the get-go. So I think doesn't that still is different than writing a book, and still could have a lot of the exploring you're talking about. But it's definitely a different starting point than one would have had, 30 years ago.
Yeah, that's great. I mean, I think you're right about that the ambitions and also the ways in which interdisciplinarity has moved, right? And has opened doors and spaces and possibilities for knowledge production that is creative, um, delinked from the colonial matrix, queer and trans and you know, anti-racist from the get-go, and forms of kind of entering into the conversation, I think, that already benefit from, you know, so much work that's been done over the past 30, 40 years. So I agree with you. I think that's really well put. And I love that about really getting to that place of kind of creative impetus. So I saw that there was a question already, and I think, I mentioned your post on Facebook and Blue Sky, and it was also mentioned in the introduction. So I wondered if you wanted to jump into the topic of what is changing currently in publishing, and also maybe to take a step back. I mean, you are such a key figure and key figure for academic publishing, a touchstone, a mentor, a mensch, someone who's really carried so many generations at this point of us, of scholars, creators, writers, with you, and really forwarding Duke University Press with such a strong vision. So it's, can you take us back a little bit and say a little bit about, you know, what's memorable for you over this long arc in your career in publishing, and then maybe take us to the point of what you see is really changing in the industry.
Well, it's an interesting, and that's too generous, but I think it's changed the whole time. And we've just reached, and this, I'll be interested in why you're not calling it the neoliberal university, because I was an early resistor to that term. But a lot of what I was writing about in the post is actually, I think, a neoliberal problem, which the way I've been thinking about it is like, does Brown or Hunter College or whatever university college have classics because they think classics is important, or Asian studies because Asian studies is important, or does it matter how many seats are being filled, or is there independent funding for this program, so that like the really horrible phrase, every tub on its own bottom, that is, every program should be self-supporting. Um, that is, I feel like, what has kind of happened to the press. Like, the press is now in a place where we were always supposed to be self-supporting. The university never supported us. But instead of thinking, oh, here's this important part in a scholarly ecology where we're tenuring people based on publications from university presses, where libraries would like things priced in a kind of rational way rather than an extractive, like Springer Verlag, Elsevier kind of way. Um, all those kinds of things have broken down for do you have the funding for yourself? So the stuff that was originally applied to the sciences and was grant dependent, and we see where those grants are now, has just then been spread to humanities and social sciences where it never belonged in the first place. And I think presses are part of that system. But if I go backwards, like when I came to the press, I had been working at the Seminary Co-op bookstore in Chicago, very academic bookstore that book culture up by Columbia's modeled on, for about 9 years, and doing the displays. And that's where my sense of like the interdisciplinarity came from, just watching what people bought, what excited them. And also the sense that the people who bought the most books were grad students and junior faculty, that people at our level waited for someone to go, oh, have you looked at that? I think you'd really like it. That would be helpful with what you were saying about your project. But the people who came in all the time to look at things and hoped that it would solve their writing problems were more junior people working on their work. And when I left, I got a job working for California and Princeton and Basil Blackwell, going around New England and New York State down to 48th Street in Manhattan, going to bookstores. And it was very messianic. I was like, oh, if we can sell all these books opposite the University of Chicago, what about Ithaca? What about Providence? What about New Haven? Only to find that like everybody was running their own bookstore. And, the then Yale Co-op, when I had like Torrell Moy's Chris Dava reader, they were like, well, we don't need that. And I was like, you're Yale French Studies. Like, of course you need that. And they were like, all right, two, and the people running the bookstore just had nothing in common with, or no interest in what the actual students there would be interested in reading. But when I started at the press, getting books that could reach bookstores and that people could buy was the concept. And then as the chains like Barnes and Noble and Borders pushed a lot of those bookstores out of business, then I think presses in general first tried to figure out, well, what will the chains want? And so it was kind of a little mini boomlet in the mid 90s of books being saleable because chains want to have everything. Then, of course, in a different form of neoliberalism, their auditors came through and were like, oh, what things turned 7 times in the year? What turned 6 times in the year? So you got the more impoverished version of any section at Barnes and Noble that you would find now. But a lot of the independent stores were already gone. And that time around the year 2000, when electronic forms were beginning to surface, was also the time that what books were teachable became very important. So it's like, oh, literary criticism, which had been such a theory leader in the 80s and early 90s, that was rarely taught unless it was like Said or something that was a big theory book. Otherwise, you teach the novels and talk about what people said. But then the kinds of books that we were doing that were interdisciplinary, Lisa Lowe, Starts of Queer Color Critique, Lauren Berlant, those kind of interdisciplinary books people were teaching and people were buying outside of the academy. And the move from being so literary at Duke to being much more anthropology oriented and kind of those sorts of embodied theory books that people would teach was very successful. But you had to keep following, like, well, what are people interested in at a given time? So part of the challenge, and that's why I've always described this as kind of like two things I don't do, surf or play video games, but you have to, it's a kind of completely changing landscape all the time, both commercially and then academically. So who's teaching their own books? So when I started, people in cinema studies and TV, the former version of your department, taught a lot of the same books they wrote. It was very successful. Then at some point it switched to like, oh, we're all going to have readers and different forms of like course packs and stuff, and became like a hard place to publish. So you're always kind of looking at how things have switched, but that was the basic idea. And what's really changed lately that's been so um, kind of has made it seem like a dead end, which is like, well, what if nobody's buying any books for their classes? And what I've seen is more like, oh, people will get everything on PDF. Then if there's a book sale or they're at a conference and the book is discounted, they'll be like, oh, I really love Cruel Optimism. I should really have a copy. So you're kind of secondarily, the optimism pin Lauren bought me in Chicago. Uh, then I should really have a copy. That becomes the secondary thing rather than, I think, what you or I experienced, people building their libraries, getting a sense, especially as grad students, having the books they thought they would need for their career, and buying things because they were useful to have them for the classes. And then if they didn't turn out to be useful, lending them to people or reselling them or whatever. But the question of like, okay, so who is the audience now for these fields? Like the very things that are the places that I feel like I've helped build that are the places theory goes forward. Who's the audience for them? And that's when you think about most of those questions, it's not that there isn't a version of, you know, uh, transnational Asian pop culture or queer of color critique or uh, why do right-wing regimes use a pretended care for women to advance their right-wing agendas. There are popular versions of this, but mostly our work, what we've done in our own projects, the audience is us. And the question of like, how do people assume this will be carried on in the kind of curated and edited way if us isn't buying the very things that we're doing for ourselves is really kind of what motivated my question.
I mean, you brought up so many good topics there, and I could take us in a number of different directions, but I think I want to respond to a couple of things. First, I think you're absolutely right about, hesitating on the term neoliberalism, but then understanding it's the dismantling of, everything that is a kind of public good as part of that. But I think for me, the term has just lost so much meaning in terms of its utilitarian value, but also its ability to analytically describe the kind of social and economic worlds that we're living in that are very much disintegrating, part of the larger racial and extractive capitalist complex, and the ways in which, something like intellectual work fits into that, or the intellectual publics, as it were, which is such a beautiful title for the series. I mean, I think that's one aspect that, I've been thinking a lot about, just definitely writing from the global South, and how you, as I said, seeing, how this is shifting in publishing. I could see it in a kind of how, civil society, as it were, the kind of disintegration and attack on civil society in the Americas and, other places, but certainly in Latin America that I study more deeply, that's all part of this experience that we're having now of something like authoritarian capitalism. So I want us to continue to keep that in mind as we have this conversation, because of course there are the structural forces that impinge upon the university settings or the audiences and all of those questions that I think you're talking about. But I want to talk for a minute and respond to you kind of as a teacher, and thinking in the classroom and graduate seminars and giving a very concrete example. So this semester I had the great opportunity to teach with Ariela Azulay, and we taught a course called a graduate seminar, and it was called Metals, Mining, and Jewelry. And we often joke that I was the mining person and she was the jewelry person, and we'd meet at the metals. And that was how we were kind of thinking about the course. And it was a course of creative praxis and also theory. We did assign our own work in that class, and I think you can do that in a collaborative setting. And part of the reason we did that is because we wanted to get to know each other more as intellectuals. We wanted to engage, our students on their creative and intellectual work, and encourage them to, circulate that at various points in the semester, various invitations that we offered. But I think one thing that was in putting that syllabus together, most things, okay, because we did some work that was not available in translation, whether it be French or Spanish, and we had to figure this out. But most of that work was available as ebooks through the library, or the first chapter of the book. And we discussed a lot about that, not the first, the introduction. And so I want to kind of pursue this conversation with you around the introduction. And I have many thoughts about this, but one is the introduction was often available, right? It was available as a PDF. It was a teaser moment. You go on Duke University website, you can get the introduction as PDF. And some of the conversations that I remember Ariella and I having were about, well, that is not the book. The whole of the book is not in the introduction, and we're missing a lot when we don't engage that beyond that. But it's not just missing the sites of explanation or theory making or the embodied studies, or what we used to call case studies, which, we wouldn't speak about it that way anymore, but the kind of sites of critical inquiry. It's also missing how the author, or opportunities to engage how a writer thinks or an author thinks over the arc of a book, right? So I just wonder if you could say something about the introduction, because, when I was an assistant professor and we first met and were having these conversations, I remember you saying to me, right, and other people have said this, but I remember this poignantly from you, the work of that introduction, how massive that is in order to carry us. So yeah, if you could just respond a little bit to some of those ideas, like what is the work of the introduction now, or
Mhm.
um, you know, stylistically, why we want to carry a reader through the entire project, and not just in questions of accessibility, but in terms of really developing argumentation and pressing down on theory making over the arc of a book.
Right. Well, that's a great question, and I think it is an irony that the giving away the introduction and my encouraging people to put their argument in the introduction have worked at um, cross purposes, at least in relation to sometimes. Other times, people are like, "I read the introduction. I'm really excited to see it," which is also see the rest of the book, which is great. But to me, and this goes back to like the kind of more concreteness of how do you get from the genre rules of the dissertation, even a creative one, to what people need to have in a book. I always wonder like how anyone could start anywhere else because you need a voice. Like, who am I going to be as the author's voice in this book? And it's really unlikely that somebody could start in chapter 3 or chapter 4, especially with something they had written before as an article or a dissertation chapter, and make a kind of active decision about their voice from there. And then you also need a kind of what the argument is going to be. And part of what I've always thought was most determinant about the dissertation was the audience. Basically, when you're on somebody's committee, it's your job to read to the end. Brown's paying you for that. So however it goes through, however unevenly it is, when you're going to get to the end and things will add up to something. And really, in dissertations, I think a lot of times people don't even need an argument or that matter, a kind of narrative that brings people through it. That it can be a perfectly great dissertation on, if you were going, I'll just make something up, if you were going to do have a student want to work on queer Filipino film, and you're like, okay, so then they have a chapter on something from the 70s and something from the 90s and something more recent, and some's by men and some by women, and they all have these different issues, and then you see like the variety. That could be a dissertation. Wouldn't be like, wow, stop the press's dissertation, but it could be a dissertation. In a book, that wouldn't really feel like that much of a book. It would just feel like, oh, here's 3 films being talked about. So the person has to kind of figure out, what was I trying to say? What I had that, like you were talking about earlier, I had this inkling that in this material there was something really important. What is that important thing? And how do I want to come down on it? And knowing what you're going to argue has to then govern what somebody would need to be convinced. And that convincing could be narrative, like if it's a history, it could be evidentiary, it could just be like in some like Katie Stewart way that it creeps up on you as you read. But until you know where you want, what you want the person to get out of it, it's hard to know what they should read following. So for me, the idea of like putting the introduction first was really kind of, maybe it's too much like get in the water and swim like me, but it's really kind of the like, oh, how do you have to think about yourself as author in this new context? You have all this material. What do you want somebody to get out of it? Who are you trying to address? And how can you get away from like the dissertation situation of like you have some senior faculty who you love and are impressed by, and they're going to like tell you you did a good job, to get to the point of like, oh, who am I writing for? Which I always say, like, why don't you be writing for the people entering grad school? Write for people who are already excited and want to know what your ideas are. That's a whole different form of writing. And I think the people need some space to kind of figure that out. And often the introduction is the place for that.
Yeah, that's really great. I mean, as you were speaking, I was thinking about moments when we've actually been in discussion over books that have been, for instance, submitted to series and, the Dissident Ant series with Diana Taylor, but, working with you on that. And often, as we kind of go around the table, as it were, and give our impressions, there's a question about, does this sound too much like a dissertation, or is this, where does the author begin to kind of just flap away and really take off with their own ideas and their own kind of, questions and concerns and that work of transition. I'm just trying to be mindful because I imagine many people have tuned in here who are exactly at that point and thinking about, okay, going from graduate student presentations and conferences and, bits of the work to trying to take away the scaffolding, right, that a dissertation has. And that's complex. That's complex. Um, I don't know if in the first book I had that exact experience. My first book wasn't published with you. It was published with UC Press. And I had a real opportunity to, I think I got a contract, I was very fortunate a year after I entered my job. But I will say, looking back, I think there are ways in which, and I say this a lot to first, second, third year my graduate students is, how you begin to shape your project, how the problems that are in early parts of the project, they tend to follow you. And it's very, very hard to kind of then, glean some of that away and just take off those pieces because, you know, writing, I think this is true of critique, the work of critique and works of critique about representation, um, you know, they do build over time, as you were saying, a voice builds over time, but also a kind of way of entering into the material. And so I wonder if you could just say a little bit more about that, whether you can say something about what resonates for you when you read work that sounds like, okay, this is a Duke book. Yes, we've made that transition, and that's clear in terms of either originality, contribution, or voice, but also that question of, you know, where the work of scaffolding begins, I guess. I don't know if that makes sense, but I'll
What do you
pass it.
mean by the scaffolding?
I mean, for me, the scaffolding is a lot about citational practice,
Oh.
moving through, that cocktail party that you're discussing or you're with, in the history of ideas to be a little bit more serious about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're entering into a massive history of ideas and standing on the work of so many other people. And I think there are two poles there. On the one hand, there's a pole of kind of hiding behind all of that as scaffolding and not, entering into, well, what do I think about this? How am I situating my work here? What are the, what are the approaches that I want to kind of consider?
Mm-hmm.
So that's one aspect. But the other is almost, can be the other problem of a little too thin in
Right.
terms of, and that is something that I kind of feel is something I want to think about and contend with students now. It's like, what is that larger history? Take a step back, not just 10 years of citations, but 40 years. Not to say that all has to be in there, but right. I mean, some of these questions we've been circling around for a long time. So,
Mm-hmm. But also like the thinness, you know, letting the quotes from other people and the things like neoliberalism take the place of doing the thinking. So I always like think about Andrew Ross's instructions to grad students of like giving each of them like 10 words they can't use, even at the dissertation. Like, because if you can't just say imperialism, then you have to explain what you think the relationship actually was. And having that kind of texture and that fullness of thinking is and the scaffolding at the same time that's part of the challenge. Like, how do you show that you have both of them? But I'm kind of a pluralist about this. I feel like there are lots of different purposes for different kinds of books. And, you know, if you were, you know, you could be doing, anybody could be doing different kinds of series that would have other things as kind of sensible components, and different presses have different modes of like what they're doing. And this kind of will go back to like the who's the audience now question. But, you know, when there used to be a Cornell series called Studies in German Women's Autobiography. So I guess if you were writing on German women's autobiography, you knew where to publish. But I assume everything wasn't supposed to be a big surprise. It's just supposed to be helping fill out the critique of German women's autobiography. Whereas for me, I'm always looking for like what's unexpected here. And my characteristic thing is if you say what the approach is and what the objects are, if I can predict how it's all going to go, it feels kind of boring. And the thing that gets me excited, and I guess I've been using for a year the example of Siobhan Angus's fabulous Camera Geologica book, where she's like, oh, you can't tell the history of photography without it being a history of extraction, and starts back with like the amount of silver and gold needed for daguerreotypes, and then goes through all the different periods. As soon as I saw that, obviously I had to look and see that it had the kind of thickness of research, but the idea immediately made sense. And I was like, oh, this is something that will change the way people think. And that's kind of what I've looked for. And the kind of what is frustrating about this conjuncture that I've been describing is that kind of depends on an audience of readers willing to like go for our books by people who are changing the way people think, and not in the way that I thought we had gotten out of. So like where and when I entered, people would do like, oh, they're going to buy Jameson, they're going to buy Spivak, they're going to buy, you know, all the kind of books by the big people. And then everybody else like was doing their ordinary work underneath. And one thing I've really worked to do is like to support, and this is very gendered, but like to support women and women of color as theorists, and they don't have to wait for somebody to like give them like a admittance ticket. The ticket comes right away as soon as you have ideas. But that depends on people actually reading each other's work and citing it and feeling like, oh, we're in this community and we're exchanging these ideas. And part of that is upholding the way that we do it by teaching and reading the book. If that's not there, then as a press, then we have to go back to like, oh, what are the places where there's enough readership outside of the academy? You know, so Sammy Schock's book, Black Disability Studies, which is open access, but has still sold, and this is just paper, not even the Kindle version, like 7,000 copies, 6,000 or 7,000 copies, even though anybody could get it for free. And she has the earrings with the QR code, so you could see how to do it. So it's like, okay, so there are trans books on trans issues, a lot of the Black Thought books that are so crucial, whether that's Fred Moten or Alexis or Christina Sharp. Those books have lots of audience of people who need them for life. So that's really great. And I'm happy doing those books because I'm happy making a difference in more people's worlds. But I also want to keep the idea that, like, oh, the forms that one, people need to write the first books to get to places they might be more expansive, and two, that all the different areas have different kinds of knowledges you need to develop in a kind of detailed way, as you were saying. So how do you capture both, and how do you keep doing those books so that it's not just the press narrowing to the things that would cross over to the wider, but a kind of balance of both?
I mean, that makes me think a little bit about, the ways in which you do steward books through the process and alongside sometimes other editors or sometimes, nurturing for a long time. And I certainly experienced that with Extractive Zone, which was my second book, not my first book. And I often, I guess I'll say that I do think that I was happy to have Duke as my second book. I think the way in which by that time I was an assistant professor moving on to associate. I was at USC. I was in sociology and also American Studies and ethnicity at the time, thinking about interdisciplinarity, thinking about, that is a book that took me a very long time, 10 years. And I remember early conversations with you where you said, yeah, I think that th this might be more than, right? This might be multi-sided work as you're envisioning it. It might have a larger theoretical kind of project that it's after. It's not going to immediately unveil itself in a particular way. And so I think that's something, that kind of longer arc of work that's very different, right, from the kind of market driven, let's get the memoir out now. And not to, I love memoir. I'm doing some memoir now, but memoiristic work. But I think there's there is a way in which I think a lot, for instance, of something that Shelley Streepy said in a post a long time ago, when X was Twitter, and talked about the ways in which there is critical work. There is an importance for academic work in a changing moment when people are seeking agents, or there's a kind of quick take, or there's this kind of nonfiction turn, all of which is great. She wasn't condemning or critiquing that, but she was saying there is this place for this deeper kind of reflective, longer research and engaged, kind of critical work. So I just want to return to that and remind myself of that, remind, our audience here of that. And like, what is the work? Why does it matter that we're doing this work within the history of ideas, in these deeper genealogies? And not to say that all of it has to be at a particular register or even engaged, or for 10 years or 12 years in that way. But I am interested in this kind of the importance of critique, especially in a moment with ongoing genocide in Palestine, the intensity of the kind of transition that we're experiencing, the kind of, pending, the world is turning in the wrong direction, say, and here we are, sitting in and working with each other, engaging in this critical work. So, yeah, what would you say to that? Why does this work matter so much in this moment? I mean, I think it clearly does, especially given that the universities and sites, so-called liberal institutions are under attack, but I'd love to hear your take on that.
Yeah, no, I've always felt there's a, like, for all his problems, a quote I've always liked from Althusser, which was, there's also a battle in philosophy. So I think that was a response to like May 68 and like, what could you do? But I feel like in any field, and this is probably why I've been so promiscuously operating across fields, there are always people trying to like think a different way and open up for a different form of thinking. And that's often political, but sometimes it's just like, this really isn't describing what we're trying to describe. And that each of those versions at different scales has a task that can be a worthwhile task. And part of what makes me feel despondent about the present is that was underwritten by, oddly, a form of kind of liberal capitalism where there was enough sales to make it possible to be doing something. And if that collapses, then what holds up that work? What makes that work possible? And do we like end up abandoning that work or narrow casting it, like in the kind of, oh, you know, Cambridge doing 6,000 books a year, and it could be a $150 hardcover, and they'll sell it to 250 libraries, and their work is done. Is that really the future we were trying to get to? And I don't think so. I think we were trying to have this much more open thing. I also have something to say about the long arc of the second book, but you might want to respond on that first, or. So when you were talking about the space you had for the second book, I think that's a really one thing that is kind of the second book problem, can be like the openness of that space without the 10-year deadline. And so the trick of how to get enough space to feel like, what kind of genre do I want to write in? What do I want to say? How do I get this to be like this new form of work that I'm going to be involved in creating without it just kind of shape-shifting along without ever coming to a kind of textual conclusion is one of the biggest challenges, I think, that people find unexpected in second books and second, third books, because there's not somebody in their department usually governing them. People already thought, well, you wrote that great first book, so don't you know how to write a second book now? And instead of like, oh, here's the thing, I workshop with Herman a million times, and now I'm ready to like turn it into a book, then you have something that you're kind of creating from scratch as you're researching. And the way that that kind of inspiration from different things one reads, from different conferences, from different conversations, then it's hard to go, okay, I actually want to like get this book to exist, and I'm going to get it out. And what is it that signals that to you, to oneself? And how do you make that happen rather than people having to come in and rescue you or do other things to kind of say, wouldn't you like to get to full, or, that kind of chair work that you do so well?
Yes, the chair work. I mean, I think one of the reasons, of course, that the second book is so intense is because you're not protected anymore. Not that many of us were ever protected from the institution in terms of either service work or, that kind of labor. But I think there is a way in which, yes, the openness of the field of interaction and possibility is certainly there. I mean, I think, before we turn, I know we have about 5 minutes before we want to turn to some of the kind of Q&A from the participants. Thanks you all for continuing to stay with us. We're excited to turn to you, and I see many familiar names on the list of participants. So please jump in terms of your questions. We're happy to engage you. I think I don't want to, leave our conversation, Ken, without kind of discussing this moment in terms of what it means to write and publish now. And I think you've been addressing that at the level of, yes, one concrete thing is we need to buy the books. We need to continue to create that marketplace of ideas. And that is sometimes coming, even if it's 3,000 books, which is great, 4,000, 7,000, right? But you're talking, we're not talking
1,000.
Right. 1,000 is wonderful, So I think people don't realize the kinds of numbers that we're thinking about and what it means to maybe assign full books in our courses and to engage, when we do these reading groups I think reading groups are fabulous. Right now, in the way that Moten and Harney intended, but also the way that, Black study has always been with us and study in many societies. So study around particular books. These are really, really important modes to kind of support what you're suggesting. And, if you're that kind of, ahead in the winds telling us this, I think we have to pay attention. We have to pay attention to what you're saying about supporting Duke University Press, supporting our university presses. I didn't think I'd come with such an impassioned speech about this, but I really hear that from your responses. And I know that also series editor. So I do want to say that. And I also want to turn to this idea that I think these impossible times, or the characteristic of these impossible times, maybe like COVID, maybe differently from COVID, maybe like other periods prior, that I do think I've heard a lot of, my interlocutors, people that I've invited to Brown or that places I've gone and communities I've been in discussion with, it is difficult to write right now. It's not an easy moment, and for many reasons, right? For the pressures, for the acceleration that we're facing, for the feeling of being in dire times, end times, end of the world. It's always been the end of the world for many people, continues to be the multiple apocalypses, but also a sense of kind of dread. I mean, you're saying that about, and you tend to be a critically hopeful person. I'm using that Paulo Freire term rather than liberal hope, critically hopeful person. And you're talking about, this, thinking with Leanne Batasamosake Simpson came recently to Brown and said, put the question very, very pointedly to us. How do we write through times of genocide? What is that urgency? And how do we continue to do that work in the multiple communities that we're engaged with? I see questions about that around, trans futures already on the table. So what would you say to that? I mean, I think I kind of responded already and said, yes, I mean, this is the critical work. This matters, so much now. You mentioned the Duke Brown collaboration we just had on climate change, global Blackness and decolonization. We titled that In the Dissolution, literally thinking with the fullness of what it means to be in the dissolution, to write from the dissolution in that space of survivance and that sliver edge of possibility. So I'd love to hear from you on some of those issues, anything that I touched upon there.
Yeah, no, I think that there are two parts of it. One is the difficulty of the writing practice when there's so much going on all the time, and how you get the focus and give yourself permission to actually be in one's own work, which is huge. And especially at a time when anything from research budgets to funding that came from grants to like everybody's losing all the tools that they were hard won to be able to do their work in the first place. During the first of the current president's administrations, I thought this wasn't true for everybody, but I felt like for a lot of people, it was a really purposive time. One could be writing something to make a difference in people's lives. And one of my, not a first book author, but, for years, like I couldn't go on the then Twitter without seeing Sarah Ahmed's book being tweeted about, like living a feminist life got me through this week, or people using Alexis Gums in that way, or your work, or Jack's work. So that the idea that people need these books for their lives, that this could be somebody, when I saw Teen Vogue do a thing on necropolitics, I was like, all bets about who the readerships for what we write and think through are off. It's like if I were a Teen Vogue age reader, which I guess I am, then it would be like, this is what I need. So you think like what in people's work is actually, who are they addressing and how are they offering people something? And I think, you know, that doesn't always happen in first books, but if you think about like Max Liboiron's Pollution is Colonialism, that's a book zillions of people have found helpful. That was the first book. So it's like partly what's your address? Who are you saying something to? And how does your work help people get through this time in a way that they could really benefit from? And you could feel grateful and they could feel grateful. And that's a hard question. It doesn't fit every single person's project. But I think that kind of sense of purposefulness in this time and that the writing could make a difference for someone else's lives, that's a lot better than writing because, like, oh, the German section of the MLA wanted me to write an essay on this writer, so I might as well write a book on them. So I think that part now and while we can is really absolutely as true as before. Um, from I feel like at the time it was kind of more of a good side. Now I don't necessarily think there is a good side, but I still think the kind of thinking about people whose ideas, I mean, I watch a lot of TikTok and you see just like ordinary things like a woman finding a girlfriend in having grown up in a Christian environment where that wasn't allowed and being happy, then you get a whole bunch of comments who are like, thank you for making that seem possible. So it's like in our writing, what are we making seem possible? What kind of thinking are we giving to people? What kind of tools for getting by, getting through, or understanding exactly the impossibility of the times can we put into it?
That's so beautiful. Thank you for kind of giving us these glimmers because I think we need them right now and we need them in so many ways. And, you know, Kathy Davidson has described this as we need, the kind of work that we're doing, the scholarship, it prepares us for the now. This kind of idea that the critical now is part of our analysis and our training. Having a series of conversations with, the great Avery Gordon as well about this is, so much of the work that scholars have done has been about pulling apart these moments to be able to understand this now. So we do need this in so many ways. And I also think, how I feel reading Benjamin or reading, certain kind of authors from the past that are witnessing these critical edges, and others, so many others, I mean, I think one of the things I want to take away is from Francisco Huichagueo, the Mapuche visual artist, who talks about his video work with Mapuche communities in frontline spaces as an archive for the future. And that became something very central to me in my work, this understanding that it's not just a kind of past present view, but this kind of future oriented view as well, that we can't see, to go back to Stuart Hall, all the contingencies, articulations, disarticulations, all of that. So I just want to thank you for that kind of perspective that opens us up a little bit and allows us to not be so much in the dumps about this moment in the sense of that our work does really, really matter. So thank you, Ken. I wonder if we should open up now and see if we can't take some questions. And I know there's some that are written. People are welcome to pop more in there. We'll start with Yanis, who is asking really about the importance of linguistic craft, skill versus profundity, cutting edge originality of underlying ideas behind a book, and wondering if we can give some examples where one overpowered the other in a successful way, but also in an unsuccessful way. Should aspiring new authors put their emphasis more on the power and interplay of the big picture ideas in their book, or consider readability, style, editorial consistency, etc. I'll pass that to you, Ken.
I would say that's not a helpful binary, because I think you want both. And it depends who one is writing for. So if you're writing for interdisciplinary scholars, Maya Kronfeld's popped up in the chat, so I will say, supposing you're writing about Adorno, then you have to you can assume that everybody who's going to read a book on Adorno probably is somebody able to read the language that you would expect to see in a discussion of Adorno. Same if you were working on Russian autobiographies of the 19th century and that's who you were addressing. If you were trying to do Black disability studies, or you were trying to do a kind of Rod Ferguson queer of color critique and have it accessible in a larger way, then you'd have to think about other forms of writing. But my sense is, and this is one thing that I've thought really social media has emphasized, is there's a big separation between the quality of the ideas and that kind of over academic language. And, often when I'll give talks on this, I'll ask people well, where's the smartest thing you saw last week? And lots of times it'll turn out, oh, it's on a blog. It was in a graphic novel. It was in a Substack. It was in somebody's comment on Blue Sky. So that the idea that the smartest ideas only come in the most academic forms, I think that's kind of opened up. So finding the right language for who you're trying to reach and what the ideas are, I think that's the general purpose. What's your sense?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's really, I like what you said. I don't think I have a lot more to say on that, except for there are a lot of questions as I kind of scroll down about what it means to do these kind of crossover books and retain kind of academic integrity or training or that kind of depth aspect. I think that is very challenging. Both Jeff and Jerry are asking about this, and um, one thing I would consider is that in the kind of more commercial nonfiction market, there is a way, a kind of editorial approach that is different about knowledge production and does maybe emphasize storytelling more, or, the kind of how to communicate to those audiences. But there are books, for instance, at Duke that have been like that. Dear Science, for instance, it's been very important, McKintrick. But I think so you're open to that. I think that, there is a way in which many of us are trying to find the form for the work rather than assume that the academic form is the form. And by that, I mean an introduction with 4 or 5 chapters that have kind of analysis of a kind of cultural, site or object or something like that. That can work, certainly, but what are the kind of the other ways in, right? The other ways in, or are there, I mean, this book that I'm working on now on decompositions at the sea's edge is taking me a while because I've rewritten it in many ways to try to find its form. And you've been so kind in helping me kind of really cull that kind of more poetic approach to the work that has a theoretical and embodied quality to it. So I think that capaciousness is in Duke in part because Duke and other presses, not exclusively Duke. I think Minnesota is doing some work there, but you know, in part because we understand and you understand that how we language things is so important, right? And so language itself is a kind of theoretical work, if you will. I could say a lot much more about that, but I think I'm with you in trying to not posit this as a binary.
Right. And there are things that cross over quite a bit, like Fred Moten, that there's a lot of payoff for difficult writing, and it's convincing. And There are other things that cross over because the writing is written in a more conventional trade storytelling way, and you just need to be good at whichever version that you're doing. But I think the kind of, and this goes to maybe Jeff Jarvis's question, I'm about to undertake editing a crossover academic trade book series. I'd like to hear your wisdom on holding true to the standards of academic publishing while gaining larger audiences via trade. Is there a risk of the latter corrupting the former? Can the latter support the former? Is there a line to help guide authors? And I think that would depend on, you know, who, I mean, trade is often used from the academic side as if it's all the same, whereas there are a whole bunch of different readerships. So it kind of depends on who you're trying to reach as readers. But I think in most cases, most of us would rather read something engaging. And that if the ideas are really good academic ideas, then it doesn't really, we're not mostly looking, we might be looking to make sure that the person has read the things that we think of, like are there some notes or bibliographic materials that show us they know what they're talking about. But mostly it's the good idea that's going to make the academic difference. So I feel, and you know, I've long thought that historians, and especially American historians, have a kind of advantage of that because narrative telling of the stories is kind of built into the discipline in a different way, or can be. There's a more general readership for different kinds of stories at different periods of time that are historical stories, like Martha Jones or now or whatever. So how to do that in other disciplines is a different kind of a problem, and it's different for anthropologists than would be for literary critics or people trying to capture Mapuche thought and present it in a way that would be helpful to other people here. But I think trying to find the examples that you want to model, and if it's going to be a series, is there an example you'd want to model for the authors, a way of showing people where the balance could be? And trying to like maintain the dedication to the balance means a little kind of herding on both sides, you know, policing on both sides or opening up on both sides so that they both stay going.
That's great. So I want to kind of take us to a couple of different places now and work with something that Marcela Fuentes has said in the chat, and then move to some questions that Sharina Razik has posted in the Q&A and see what we both think. So the first set of contributions by Marcela is about, you know, what is it that we can learn from scholars and activists from the Americas? And more broadly, I think, Marcela, you're thinking about translation and those questions to help us broaden our repertoires, you know, and what about works in translation? And I know we've had this discussion. We've had it also with Diana. It's not so easy to kind of translate works within this fold, but we do have some ideas. I mean, one of the things we've talked about is subvention through either research funds or raising funds in other places, supporting that work, because that is work that needs some kind of financial support. But I just want to lift this point that I do think, like, you know, going along the kind of decolonial path and with Mignolo and so many others, that this kind of knowledge production is linguistic, right? And we have to decolonize our kind of linguistic knowledge production. And so, you know, that work of translation. One thing I do want to say about Duke as well is I've had extremely wonderful experience with the international office who, you know, does this work of contracts for translation, has supported, you know, supported my book, The Extractive Zone, to be La Zona Extractiva in Spanish. But I think you're right. What I see you pointing to, Marcela, there is the kind of south-north or east-west dialogues and what those can bring into the fold. So Ken, I'll pass that to you, and then we can move on to Sharina Razik's question.
This is, I can remember giving a talk on this 20 years ago in Taiwan, because I feel like one of my biggest dedications was bring thought from elsewhere, but it always needs it needs a readership. So you could translate somebody who's like the most important feminist in Sri Lanka, but if nobody knows why they're important or what the context is, who's going to be picking up the book? How will it kind of catch on? And one of the problems that's a US problem is exactly who is the readership. Like both Kwan-Sing Chen in Taiwan and people I've talked to in Japan would say, oh, the people who here would only read the Wall Street Journal and the Economist or the Wall Street Journal and the Financial Times, they'd be reading the equivalent of social text in Tokyo. You'd expect like young bankers to be engaged politically, and they'd want to know what is going on in this kind of thought, even if they disagreed with it. So it's partly a question about how do you create the readership. So I think that's one place, like something like a graphic novel has actually done a lot of good work. Um, and then also the like, how do you make something seem necessary? So how do you bring the light on something that people might not have been able to read if there wasn't something that showed them what it was going to be?
Yes.
And that's a translation task. That's not the same as just reading it. But I think there's also an imperial problem in assuming we could read anything, and I feel like Indigenous studies and First People studies has been very good at it, like saying like, no, you're not going to understand that. It's not for you. And it's not even for all of us. So how to figure out like, well, what's the kind of right way of creating both readership and context and presentation so it honors everything? That's a problem if you're doing an art show. It's a problem if you're doing publishing for sure.
Mm. I think it's a great question. And I think, it's very interesting also to watch the kind of knowledge circuits and who does get translated, who doesn't. But also, I mean, it's very, in a positive sense, watching someone like Silvia Rivera Cusicanqui's work, really rise in terms of citation. And even though it's theorized from the Andes, there's so much to say about insurgency and the possibility of a kind of future from within a diminished present. And so I do think a lot with these kinds of possibilities. And I just want to address that I think what's interesting about kind of academic publishing is it is also flexing in front of the moment. There are more, possibilities of online books that have like media dimension and that can circulate more broadly. Or I think about, the fact that maybe some of us, who are in these more privileged positions can, in terms of accessing university funding, can try to work harder on the project. There's a lot of funding right now for translation, certainly in the kind of fiction world and the nonfiction world, it's growing. So, certainly I think there could be more space. Okay, I want to go to Sharina's question now. Thank you for this discussion. We must grant ourselves permission to write in times of genocide in Palestine. Thinking about planetary ecocide, we must understand the importance of sharpening our conceptual tools because they do make a difference. I wondered if you could both speak to the work of the review stage of the first book. Are there any tricks of the trade of knowing when the work is ready to send? I would also love to hear any anecdotes that might come to mind about what the feedback or review process is like, both in its generative and more challenging moments. So I'll pass that to you, Ken.
I love the review process, so I'm happy to talk about it. And part of this is, I think, not just when I talk to other editors, I think it's not just me, but I think it's at least other university press editors. But I think we all want people's work to come out in as best shape as possible. And the idea of the review process, which might come from journal review, article reviews, where things are turned back, and then finally there's an acceptance. But there's this idea of like kind of control, whereas actually we only send things out for review if we want to publish them, if they seem exciting. And I think of the model of the test screening for a film. So the director has the film as far as she can bring it, and then invites a bunch of friends and cineasts, and people come. And then she asks them afterwards, like, where did it drag? Or, I saw you were looking at your watch there. What was going on? Or, where were you confused? Because you want the chance to make it better before it goes out into the world. So, especially for interdisciplinary things, I'd like to have, we usually have two readers, like to have people from different locations, see like where it was clear, where it was unclear. Basically, like my language is like, where did they hit a speed bump? They're reading along, and suddenly like they're like, huh, why am I reading this? And then the job of the author is to like straighten that out, not necessarily doing what the reader suggests. I think a lot of people who are kind enough and generous enough to read manuscripts, present company included, are doing it out of a kind of sense of kindness and service and wanting things to be good. And it could be Sunday night and they could be like, I just got to get this review back to Ken. And they're like, trying to like get it done, and they're like, well, they could do this. And so the thing that might be like, maybe this is a helpful idea to the reader, then gets taken by the author as if it's like, if you do not do this, your book will not get published. And it's like, no, 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 no. The main thing to focus on is, why did someone make a suggestion in the first place? What could you do to ease it for other readers? And I think just seeing what you're writing as in process, and seeing the review as part of the process so that the book can be better, will be helpful from the beginning. And the anecdote I've already quoted from today, which was from a couple months ago, which was a kind of good version of the review process. Someone was like, I really love this idea in the introduction, but then it didn't come back till chapter 4. And then the author was like, oh my God, I thought of that writing chapter 4. I was like, that's a great idea. I should put it in the introduction. But I forgot that actually, once it was there, people would be attached to it, and it needs to be somewhere in the middle. So I think of it as, how do you make it a productive process? How do you learn from it? And then how do you, but the part of the question of like, when is it ready? I feel like you don't want to send it out and you already know what needs to be done next. And then somebody's going to be in the position of like being excited about your project, but then having to tell you something you already knew. You want to have it as ready enough that you're like, okay, I got this as far as I can get it. Now help me. At least assuming you don't have like, I need the contract for my career kind of pushes, which of course people do.
I mean, I think one thing I will say about Duke University Press in particular, it is a very rigorous review process, and I appreciate that. And over time, watching it over many years now, I do think that, the kind of work that people put into the review process, it's mm, in my sphere, at least, it's not necessarily just about kindness, but it's wanting to support and imprint intellectual production in a right. And I know you meant this as well in a generous way, and I take it that way. But I think it's also, there's an aspect of intellectual labor that I really value there, which is a kind of mentorship, but also um, supporting work to be at its fullest place and at its strongest place before it goes out into the world. And I think, if you get a good reader, they will be intellectual comrades with you for a very long time, just like a dissertation advisor or something like that, or peers, whether they're invisible or visible to you, because sometimes they stay invisible. But I think there's something about the kind of quality of those reviews that may emerge in the book, or it may come up again in a different book, in a different project, because you've learned something from, someone. So that's really important. A number of questions hear about like Sarah Richter's question, where do you decide to put multidisciplinary works? Do we just go along with what our advisors say? I would say mostly. Is it dangerous to pursue publishing our dissertation outside of personal networks already existent? Interesting. And then I want to kind of add that to what Andrea has said here about trying to figure out how to publish a book that has a different genealogy that's already been published, but then part of a second book. What about creative practice and dissertation there? So books that kind of exceed, the frame of, say, like a conventional linear trajectory. There's one more question like that as well, but I'll pass that to you, Ken, to take the first discussion on that.
Well, I think sometimes your advisor knows a person's advisor knows the right place to publish the book, and sometimes they don't. And you have to really, because the arc of where a given author might be hoping to take their project from its dissertation form might be precisely away from what they were allowed to do in the committee that they had. I certainly don't expect advisors to send manuscripts to me. I expect to hear from authors and authors with good ideas. And you can approach as many different people as you like. And you could do that at conferences. You can write notes to people with here's what I'm writing about with a proposal. There are lots of different ways of exploring the possibilities. I think in terms of the multidisciplinarity, you want to be able to think of like what presses are going to be able to support the different parts of this. So I'll get things all the time that seem very interesting. They seem really smart, but I'll be like, well, but we don't publish in psychology, or we don't have this list. So you want, if you're having something that's multidisciplinary and it's like queer theory and it's classics, it's like you could write to me and say, but this is so important in queer theory. David Halpern, it got its start in classics. And I'd be like, yes, that's true, but we don't go to any of the classics meetings. We couldn't bring it there. So you want to think about what the outcome of the book is, not just what it's going to look like on your CV, but when you see how the presses circulate the books, will it get to all the people that you want to read it? The thing about the book that exceeds its place, its size, is like, okay, the thing that was in an article, does it need to be in the book again? Or does just the idea need to be kind of mentioned in 3 paragraphs and then the reader sent off if they want to see more about that in the book? And often I think, especially from books that start as dissertations, there is excess. There's stuff, I feel like I often use the comparative of a filmmaker who could shoot for 6 months. There could be 8 hours of beautiful footage, but like not all of that is the story. So you're like, what's the rhythm? What's the pacing? What needs to be here? Then there's going to be a lot of stuff on the cutting room floor. Is that the article? The thing that was the article first, is that like Eric Lott's Love and Theft, that's the core of the book? Or it's like something that's just an excessive piece? I think it's hard to say. Sorry, I know we're running close to the end, but Maka, what would you say to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a really great question. And I think there was one aspect of it, which was, you know, should we be pursuing publishing opportunities in excess of, say, the kind of existing networks that we're building? And I think, you'd be surprised how small actually academia, I mean, I think you all know, right? We see each other, we used to see each other more at conferences. We engage each other on our campuses through work, again, in person and not. But I think, I'm not sure if it's exactly about that question. It's more to me about sometimes a certain, series might have a kind of building of a kind of focus over time. And that might be interesting to publish in a series because the focus is actually doing something. Or it doesn't have to be in a series, but what I would say about Duke is that, you publish, what is it, 100 books per year, something like that?
About 150, like
150. So, right,
145, 150.
so that's a very well curated list, right? I mean, that's impactful books and academic publishing, and often on kind of cultural questions of cultural inquiry, ecology, et cetera, writ large, with political economic ramifications often. But art is there. So I think to me, it's more about that kind of venue, and trusting the fact that the review process, it is, I mean, having seen people go through what it looks like in commercial, for nonfiction or even fiction, and academic publishing, they're different animals. You can't really compare them. But I will say that if you go through this kind of rigorous process that I think Sharina's question was pointing to, something comes out of that. You
Yeah.
become a stronger writer, you become a stronger critic out of that process. And, to defend your ideas, I've gone through that with first-time authors a number of times, a few cases recently where those are very long, drawn-out processes, and we go through that as advocates, but also as, consultants. I mean, we wear many hats, right? As editors, to support people to be able to kind of make it to the other side of the review process and feeling that they have fully owned their work. So I think I want to end, Ken, on the question that we began with, that Nicoletta has brought up beautifully here, about the ways in which this knowledge making and the disciplines and the colonial university is in fact always infused with violence, and what to do about that in terms of a first book, how to address that. So you can read Nicoletta's question more thoroughly, but I think that is really something that we might end on. The way that genocide and violence have fueled the very fields we are writing for and within, and then how, if you're writing from a first book perspective, how to address those questions.
Well, I think like if you think how any of us get through the world at this historical moment, often if I'm finding myself going down a worrisome rabbit hole of blue sky things, I'm like, oh, I could actually be doing something helpful here. I could be helping someone keep their job. I could be helping someone get their book published. I feel like the kind of concreteness of our actual place in the system to help build the communities that we're a part of is what we can do. And taking one's own work seriously enough to think like, oh, what is this offering? What am I doing here that's going to help people get through this is not a bad start.
Yes, and of course, some of the projects, that I know about and that, we continue to work on actually come out of that, um, questioning kind of the epistemology of violence, um, in knowledge production itself, but also are really at the site of, key sites of extraction,
Mhm. This,
and genocidal
yeah.
violence. So, yeah.
This is part of why it's my concern to keep the university press system alive. And one of the people who responded to me on Blue Sky, who their moniker said they were in ed tech. There are lots of people who would like to just take over the space of publishing academics to extract more money from universities and charge more for licenses for digital things or for making things open access. And, we've got a little system now where things are, the presses are not for profit, and we have some control over what the possibilities are. And it's hard to see at this moment um, something opening up that's less extractive rather than more extractive. So I'm for maintaining this and using the possibilities as long as we can.
So I'm typing very quickly. Thank you, all of you, for everything, for your wonderful engagement today. Ken, I just want to say again, thank you for all the work you continue to do. Let's support Duke University Press and all university presses, as teachers, as students, as interlocutors, as writers, all of us. I think it's really, you've put the matter pretty urgently, and I think it's part of this times that we're living in, and we have to respond in kind. So thank you again. It's been lovely to be in conversation with you, Ken.
Thank you so much, Maka. This was really great, and I loved the whole thing. And I feel like we actually got somewhere, which is the intellectual publics thing. And thanks everybody for being here, and have a great night.